So how do listeners work to change the UI? So what you want to do is when you create your game so ideally you have a property setter, or your view has the game property. The view registers itself as a listener to the game. You might want to set the game actually through the activity, and that means you need to have your game view actually implement a setter to make sure that when you update the game it will listen to the new game and stops listening to the old one. And when you have such a game, we can actually so that makes the UI be able to know that the game changed, and when the game changes it will call this the listening function or listening object. That could just be your game view, and when it has this method it can call invalidate. When we have a game, we would now, so this is the kind of thing we have in the game. How do we do listener? So we have our app. Let's close all screens. Let's close this bit. When we have our app, we would have a view. So we would have a game view. Which would be a class that inherits view. Yes, Android view. And then we need to implement the constructors. I'll skip the last one because we don't need that one, because I actually know that we don't need that. And then what we do is we have a property. So var game is say student.box game. It can be any .box game. And is so we initialize this somehow with a default setting. My one doesn't take any, the default implementation has no parameters yet. So this will work in my case, it will be correct. So the getter is fine, but we need to actually override the setter here. So set the value. So when we have a value, we need to do something. First, we need to say, okay, field, which is the current value of it, dot add on so remove on game change listener this. So this will make that the game view is no longer a listener. So we need to also now we get need to actually implement that interface. Okay, let it implement that interface. We just do the quick fix. And what do we do when the game changes? Well, we call invalidate. That will get our game to redraw itself. By the way, your activity might also want to listen to game changes if it wants to do things like display the current scores of users in a text view, or handle game over by, say, displaying a game over menu. Your view could also handle game over to say, okay, now you can no longer, I will no longer respond to any presses because the game is over, it's not valid to press a button. Or you could just, when you're in your button press handling, say, okay, the game is finished, I'm ignoring it. That's another way. But if you want to disable, say, make your thing look differently when the game is finished, you can do that. Of course, you can also do that in invalidate. Check it in on draw, and then because invalidate is also called on the last move, or should also be called on the last move. So anyway, in our setter, we now removed ourselves as listener from the previous value. Then what we need to do is field the field equals value. and then we add it to value, so value dot add on game change listener this. However, there's one particular thing you need to be careful with. When you initialize a property, that will not call the setter. So if we want to make the initial game also listen to, we need to do this as well. So in this case we do the we call it. I use also because otherwise we're dealing with two this objects. We could do that, but it is tidier to use also in that instead. So it dot add on game change listener this, and this is now our game view. Why do we use also instead of let or something like that? Because also returns the original object, the student.box game. So this is how we can have a game object. We could also say, so sometimes you don't need it to be student.box game, you can just use dots and boxes game. So this is how we set the listener initially, and then we update it whenever it is set to a value. And that's how you can also have your activity pass it a game with a different configuration, maybe a computer player in there or a different amount of dots or boxes rather than the default. So this is how your listeners work. So in your game you just you find the line that was press draw line will at the end of the day call on game change, and on game change sets invalidate, which will cause your game to be redrawn. Because invalidate does that. So if we do invalidate and then Control Q, we can see here that it will actually call on draw if it is visible at some point in the future. So it won't exactly tell you when, but it will be called. So this is how you use listeners. This is how to make that work. So we need the custom setter to make it nice and tidy if you want to be able to update the game from outside. Yeah, if you find it also a bit confusing, you can instead use an init block that you do it instead. So add on game change listener this. In that case, make sure you don't have the also, because the default implementation does not check that you don't add the same listener twice. We'll happily add it twice, requiring you to remove it twice as well. And it will call your own game change twice, which is also not necessary. So that's your listener.